The library is called Tyndale House Library because Tyndale is the guy who started it all in England. He's the one who published a new translation of the Bible in English, in the English which everyone was speaking. There'd been some English Bibles before, but Tyndale managed to write it in English and publish it in thousands of copies and then smuggle them into England at a time when it was illegal to own or to read an English copy of the Bible. The church was very worried that some of the doctrines that they were teaching would come to pieces if people could actually read the text for themselves. This is one of the pages from Tyndale's Bible, written out in an English which was absolutely street English in his day, and an English which is easy to read out loud. It has a wonderful sort of sing-song voice, and the translation was so wonderful that when they brought out the authorised version, they kept 80% of what Tyndale had written, because there was just no way you could improve it.
And this is the text that Tyndale was burnt at the stake for?
Yes, unfortunately he had to translate this in Holland because it was illegal for him to work in this country and unsafe for him to work in this country. And he was part way through the Old Testament, having finished the books of Moses and was getting started on the prophets, when an agent managed to find him and they arrested him and they had him burnt for having translated the Bible into English. Here's a copy from 1526, when it was illegal to have a copy of Tyndale's Bible. And you see it's much smaller, and it would have been quite thin. The reason it's smaller is so that you can smuggle it more easily, you can hide it on your person better. If the authorities come around, you can quickly stuff it into your shirt and maybe they won't notice it. One very useful way of studying the text of the Bible is to see the very early translations that were made of it. We have the Bible in Hebrew and Greek originally. But of course the earliest communities, they weren't all Greek and Hebrew speaking, so they were translated into their own languages. And it gives us an insight into what the text looked like in their day, and also how they understood it in their culture. So these are very important ways of studying the Bible. Here we have the Hebrew text with Latin underneath to help you read the Hebrew. And then the Vulgate translation, the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation, again with Latin down the side to help you read it. The Syriac translation, a very important translation because it took place in the 1st century or 1st to 4th century. The Targum, that's the Aramaic paraphrase of the Old Testament, gives us very clear insights into how the Jews understood their text.
And when was that written?
Written down from the end of the 1st century through even to the 6th century. They were still making changes. They preserved traditions which are much older than that, and often you find hints in there of stories which we know from much older sources. The Samaritan Pentateuch, that's the Samaritan sect, they had their own version of the Pentateuch, and often this preserves very old parts which help to confirm what we have in the Hebrew text. And the Arabic, although that was translated sometime later, it still gives us very clear insights into the way in which they understood the text. Now the most important of these translations is the Greek translation, the Septuagint, because that was done 200 BC, well it was started then anyway, and it was all finished before the time of Christ. So we have here evidence of the text before Jesus was speaking. And often the New Testament authors, they quote the Greek translation because they are writing in Greek, and they have the Greek translation in their minds as they're writing. So they'll often quote the Greek translation rather than the Hebrew translation. But they each give us an insight into how the Hebrew text was understood and what the Hebrew text looked like at the time. When we're reading the Old Testament and the New Testament, we tend to start with the Hebrew and Greek. The oldest Hebrew text we have, well, the one that all scholars use as a basis of VHS, as we call it, is the Leningrad Codex, a wonderful codex, one which is very clear. This was named after the place where it was stored for a long time in Leningrad, until the British bought it. This is written on animal skins, it's written on vellum, very, very carefully. This is slightly compacted, slightly reduced in size. Very clear square Hebrew script with the pointing which tells the scribe how to pronounce it. Tells the person in the synagogue exactly how to pronounce it. And that pronunciation has been preserved very, very carefully. We've got ancient Persian pronunciation there, which we know from other sources in history. So they're not preserving just what they knew about, but preserving what was known millennia before. The other very important codex is the Aleppo Codex, which is actually a little bit older than the Leningrad Codex by a few years. It's copied out by Ben Asher, a remarkable job, very, very clear. It would be more important than the Leningrad Codex, except that it's not quite complete. We don't have the books of Moses, at least most of the books of Moses are missing from this. It used to be complete when it was in the monastery in Syria, but it was lost or stolen, the first part, and we don't know where it is now. And again, very, very clear work done by the same family of scribes as the Leningrad Codex, and remarkable. Every single letter is the same. It's a huge undertaking, taking a couple of decades of a scribe's work to get this absolutely letter perfect. Oldest complete version of the Greek New Testament is the Sinaiticus, discovered on Mount Sinai in the monastery by Tischendorf. This is a photograph, of course. The original is in the British Museum. And here I've opened it at Matthew 19, which is a place where a lot of people look to find out Jesus' teaching on divorce. And here we find, where are we? They came and asked him about divorce for any cause, Passan Etienne. Of course, scholars tend to use printed texts rather than the facsimiles, and so I tend to use the palm rather than anything else because you can quickly find your way around. So I'd you can have several Bibles at the same time. There you've got the English Bible, there's an ESV, and you've got an S.A. Allen text on the right hand side. So it's very easy to find your way around and to read your text bites and search for a word and see where that word has been translated in different ways. And you can have a mixture of different translations. You have lots of different. We've got here the BHS, and we've got the Peshitta in Syriac. We've got all sorts of translations on there. So scholars are using modern and ancient tools to find out what the original text said and what it means. But when people read the Old Testament, they don't always interpret it properly, and sometimes the society will impose its own ideas upon the community, and they'll go off the rails. We see this to a certain extent in a Jewish community in the 5th century BC, living at Elephantine, a military outpost in Egypt. There you have a Jewish community who were isolated from their own in Jerusalem, and also isolated from the community around them, and coming to their own ideas of how to marry and divorce. We got a wonderful insight into that society because we have their documents left for us. In these Aramaic papyri, which were discovered in quite large numbers, we have all sorts of documents about how to buy things and how to look after a house, how to look after your family, documents of divorce and marriage. And the divorce document is really quite striking. It appears what they did was stand up in a synagogue, and the wife would say, "I hate my husband," and the husband would stand up and say, "I hate my wife." And they're not just slagging each other off, they're not making disparaging comments about each other. This was the legal formula for divorcing each other. I hate a sana. To hate is the ancient Near Eastern form for I divorce. Legal terminology saying that I am divorcing my husband, I am divorcing my wife. And having made that public proclamation in the public place, the synagogue, that divorce would be enacted. And not what we would find in the Old Testament law, but it's the start of something, which was later to be called the any cause divorce. And it's something that came into Judaism and was later justified by Scripture in order to make divorces easier. One of the most important sources of information about Judaism in the 1st century and about the biblical text in the 1st century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are scrolls which were hidden away as treasures by the community living near Qumran, near the Dead Sea. We don't know much about that community apart from the scrolls they left. And these were the treasures that they had, the ones they wanted to make sure no one would ever take away or destroy. So they put them in jars up in inaccessible caves, and hoping that eventually someone would find them, and 2 millennia later someone did. Here's some photographs of actual bits and pieces. You can imagine a jigsaw puzzle of trying to put these together, and you think, oh, there's 2 pieces, let's put them side by side so we can read them. There are very few collections like this. Dead Sea Scrolls is a very large collection of scrolls. There are about 15 other sites around where they found fragments from that time, and every single little scrap they've been scrabbling through the dust to find, and put these together into fantastic documents which tell us about a sect which we knew nothing about before. But very importantly also, texts of the Bible. and texts which go back 2,000 years.